Well, hello and welcome to Insight with political tools and beyond the headlines. Tim Marshall has a unique way of looking at current affairs. His books, from Prisoners of Geography to Worth Dying For, Divided, and most recently, The Power of Geography, provide a refreshing way of looking at disputes, identity, and developments throughout the world. And he is, I'm very glad to say, our guest today. Hello and welcome, Tim.
Hello, Nick, and thanks for the invite.
Well, it's great to have you here. Here are just some of your books, a very large number of them. I think you're prolific. And the thing I think most of what I like most of all is probably this one here, is the illustrated one. That's my important.
Good pictures.
It's great pictures, and for someone like me, it really explains it very simply.
That's the one for 12-year-olds.
Yeah, exactly. That's for me. In some ways, this is point out the obvious, but in many ways, they point out, I think, what people seem to forget.
Yeah.
And that's really, really helpful. And that's how geography shapes nations' priorities, how flags unite a nation or people around an idea. So what we're going to do is take a whistle-stop tour through some of your work, firstly by looking at a couple of maps. And we're going to try and be as descriptive as possible, because I know some people just listen to this rather than see it online. And our first map is of Russia. But now, before we get stuck in with this, you were a correspondent with Sky, diplomatic correspondent. You've been a foreign correspondent. I can't name the number of conflicts you covered over the years. But what suddenly gave you the idea to start talking about maps?
Oh, a very long time ago, Bosnia, some horrible people had done something horrible, and I asked them why. And they said, well, we need everyone to run away from this village and tell everybody in the next village we're coming, and they'll run away. We'll have the valley. We need the valley because we need the road at the end of it. It was like a light going off, you know. Violence often is not mindless. This very cold logic to it. And so I began to more and more factor in the geography of any given situation. I mean, it doesn't have to be conflict, or, you know, the current energy crisis. If you have a good grasp of geography, I think flowing from that is a much better framing of a situation. So I approach any conflict, any country, region, from the basics of its geography, and then layer on its history, and then layer on the current affairs. I just find it clicks together better.
It's a really fundamental point, and it seems like a very obvious point. And you're not trying to make a sort of grand academic argument. You're just really saying to people, look, come on, look at the basics. Yeah,
and I'm also not being overly deterministic. I'm not saying that everything is therefore baked in. I mean, there are one or two things that are baked in. I mean, the Swiss Navy, you know, struggles. But, you know, I'm not a determinist. I'm just saying that it's one of the determining factors. And you said at the beginning, you know, it seems obvious, but there's a quote from Orwell that sometimes it takes quite a lot of concentration to see what's at the end of your nose. And I do think that we have missed out the geographic aspects too often of what's going on. I mean, just basic facts, Nick. You know, this whole issues that we're having at the moment with fuel in the UK, we haven't got enough space in a container port. Well, just tell people a very simple fact: 85% of the world's trade still moves by water, and starting from that one fact, there's lots of other things to then add on. But it's just such a simple thing to grasp hold of, and then things become apparent.
Well, let's get stuck into some stuff. We're starting with Russia. And should we just go back a bit? Moscow, where is it? How is it set up? And why does that sort of determine its pretty stringent and tough approach to foreign affairs?
Very brief history. Kievan Rus, which was more or less where Ukraine is the nucleus, the embryonic Russia. They kept getting invaded. They moved back across the flatland and set up Russia in and around Moscow, and it extends. But the key point about this map, and this is in the Prisoners of Geography book, is two basic facts. The first one, how cold it is, and so some of their ports freeze for some of the time. And even if you don't, you're still going up through the ice pack, which you hit at the Arctic Ocean.
Yeah, so basically that whole northern area is pretty redundant in terms of your access to the sea.
Yes, I mean it's a hellish problem. That's why they have, I think it's something like 35 icebreakers to try and make sure their sea lanes are open, because you can't to this day be a great power without being a sea power. So it follows from that they want a warm water port. It follows from that when the only one they've got, which is they were leasing from Ukraine, if Ukraine flips out of their sphere of influence, that was a big decision for them, and they took it. They invaded Ukraine and they took the port of Sebastopol in Crimea, and that was based on geography. Second brief one, every 35 years, more or less on average, Russia gets invaded from the west through a particular flat part, which is from the Baltic coast to where the Carpathian Mountains begin. That's flat, 300 miles wide. It's called Poland. Napoleon went that way. Hitler went that way. Germans went that way in 1914. The Swedes went that way, etc. If you're Russian, you're not going to think, well, no one's going to probably come in the future. You're going to think, given history, this might happen again. What will I do about it? And what they do about it is they attempt to dominate the flat ground in front of them, which is called Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. That is not just determined by geography. It is also determined by their history. And so you don't have to be a genius just from knowing that very, very basic geography and history.
So they
will, sorry, very briefly, Nick, that they will intervene one way or another in Belarus if Belarus begins to have some sort of rebellion. They will. It's without question.
Yeah, and I guess the slightly, I mean, it's a realpolitik view of affairs.
Great, sir.
And if you were to go back, I mean, 99, 2000, Putin's just in power. The calculation you've talked about is that it's we've got to have it, because if we don't have it, somebody's going to invade us, and everything's going to be over. And it's a sort of zero-sum game approach to politics. And
I don't like that, but it's true.
Yeah, but I guess many countries in Central Europe gave up that view, and they could have had views determined by geography, whether they were Prussia, whether they were France, and they've jettisoned that for a different brand of politics.
Yeah, well, not so much in Central and Eastern Europe. I mean, they've constantly been looking over their shoulder eastwards. But I do think that certainly at the end of the Cold War, then there was the so-called peace dividend. Well, we're paying the price now because the European countries, other than Britain and France, are simply, their militaries are not up to scratch. And it's because they were allowed to just dwindle, to be perfectly honest with you, after the end of the Cold War. Because there was almost this feeling that, well, war, that's very, very 20th century, isn't it? We don't want to be dealing with that anymore. Let's spend the peace dividend. And I understand it's why it happened, but I do think it was short-sighted because now, well, you look at what's happening with the French military, the Greek military, other militaries, they're now trying to catch up to the state of technological prowess that the Americans have, and they are 20 years off it, whereas Russia has actually made leaps and bounds in the last 20 years under Putin, who, as you probably know, described the fall of communism as the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. Not because he's a communist, but because he's a Russian nationalist.
Yeah, I guess the point I was saying was that do these fears which are determined by geography, are they absolute? And no. Germany no longer France no longer fears being invaded by Germany. So you can choose to go down a different route, and it doesn't have to be on the end all.
No, you're absolutely right, and that is the great beauty of the European Union. I mean, I'm not making a case for or against Brexit or anything here by praising the European Union, but it's de facto, it's raison d'etre is, it's an old cliche, but it's to make the French and Germans hug each other so tightly they can't get an arm free to hit each other. I think that's quite a useful, albeit perhaps trite, phrase. And in the current configuration of Western Europe, and for the absolute foreseeable future, as in decades, they will not fight each other. It's wonderful, it's fantastic, it's such a success story. Now, but if you want to give me a scenario in 50, 60, 70 years in which, let's say, the European Union is broken down and for whatever reason, they're very tense with each other. At that point, the geography would kick in.
Yeah.
Again.
Yeah. Okay. So that's interesting for me, and that's you know, it's not, because on the surface of it, if you look at all of your books, it seems to be that realpolitik is the overriding determining factor in these things, and I'm basically saying that's not everything. You're not saying it's uniquely down to this. This is an aspect one needs to be aware of.
Look, I'm aware that you know, it is a thread that runs through it, and it can come across as not bellicose, but yes, as realpolitik. But I reluctantly believe in realpolitik. I was quite influenced by a book, was it Robert Kagan, I think, Paradise and Power, in which he posited that we live in paradise, and for all the problems that we have in Western Europe, it's paradise compared to the world of power.
Yeah.
Because the moment you move outside of the EU,
yeah,
it's power that counts. It's not paradise out there. And
let's move on. Let's move on, because this is The Power of Geography, your most recent book, and we're going to move on to the next map. And this comes from that book, and that's Turkey. And this is fascinating. Even as we talk, there's stuff going on here. So tell us about Turkey's situation. I think people are probably a bit more familiar about the Russian situation, the worries about the flatlands reaching to Europe, you know, having that southern focus, you know, facing Asia, and having the frozen security of the north, but not having access to the sea. Turkey's very different. Turkey's in a sort of pivotal area. Give us a sort of an overview.
Yeah, I'm conscious that not everybody is seeing the map, so I'll try not to be too, you know, saying, you know, look at the left-hand side of it.
Yeah.
But if you look at the left-hand side of it, Turkey is actually quite secure in many ways, because it dominates the high ground, the mountains, as you move towards Georgia and Armenia and Syria. And it's not threatened. You know, 1,000 years ago, it closed the back door there. And then it controls the Anatolian plain that sits right across the very top of Turkey, where a lot of the Kurds are. They are not an existential threat, the Kurdish independence movement, to Turkey, that they are dealing with it. It's a horrible, horrible war, but it's not an existential threat. Right, Turkey, we'd established that it was a powerful place that was secure. And then the Ottoman Empire, which of course is what it was, expanded in all directions. But the point about this map, well, there's many points to it, but briefly, it's only 100 years since the Ottoman Empire lost so much territory. And on that map, there is a dotted line, and that is the maritime border of Greece. And the problem for the Turks is, because of them losing their territories in the 20s, the dotted line pushes right up against the Turkish coastline, meaning that just about all of the Aegean is Greek. And Turkey thinks, why should we put up with that? I mean, they put up with the 1920s because they just lost a war. They're no longer prepared to put up with it. There's a problem, though. It's international law. From your EEZ, your exclusive economic zone, which starts at your coastline, you have 200 miles in which that you can fish, you can drill, you can do what you like there. Which means that all the oil and gas that's been found down there in the Aegean, off both Cyprus and some of the Greek islands, is Cypriot and Greek waters. And the Turks are saying, no, half of that is ours. And that's one of the reasons why they are pushing out. As I said, this is where history, I mean, that's the geography, but the history comes into this as well. This great power, this huge, huge empire shrunk to what is Turkey, but they have this historical memory, and they have something called Mavi Vatan, I think it is in Turkish, the blue homeland theory. And their current president, Erdogan, has been pictured in front of maps showing the blue homeland. And the blue homeland has got a shaded area through about half of the Aegean and parts of the Black Sea. That's what they think they should control. That's what they intend to control. It's getting very, very tense. And France has just signed a defense deal with Greece. Doesn't mention Turkey, but it says, if either of our countries are attacked by anybody, including anybody in NATO, we'll come to each other's defense. Well, they mean Turkey. I mean, it's quite extraordinary.
That's two NATO, well, three NATO countries, essentially, pitted against each other, or two against one.
And again, geography kicks in. I mean, there's a number of things going on here which we don't really have time for, but geography really kicks in because what's in it for France? Well, at a personal level, Macron and Erdogan loathe each other. That's secondary. The Mediterranean is France's connection to North Africa and beyond, into the Sahel, the former Francophone areas, former colonial areas, which it has a very, very strong ties with. There's 5,000 troops there fighting in the Sahel, at the invitation of the Sahelian governments, I should add. They do not want a Mediterranean dominated by an increasingly powerful Turkey. So despite being a NATO member, they've taken sides with Greece, both on the gas and oil and just about anything else. So, you know, that is driven partially by the geography, but of course by the history as well, because if France had never been in those areas of Africa, it wouldn't be quite as important to them now. So there's that sort of synergy between geography and then the history.
I mean, it's a great, I've got the book, This is the Power of Geography, just here. And this is a very good illustration highlighting where potential conflicts are. And you wrote about Ethiopia, and you've spoken about it sometime before in terms of the Nile, the control of the waters of the Nile, and how Egypt felt threatened by that, Sudan as well, and that's really, that's really moved up the agenda. Those dams are being built, and that's a real area of potential conflict. So the book, if you haven't got it, this is it's a sort of guideline to where look at the possible conflicts of the future. Let's, because we're doing such a whistle-stop tour of things, we're going to put the map to one side, and we're now going to move on to flags. Now, flags are there to really, and for the most part, give a sense of unity, of national identity. And I love this one here because this is tell us what we're looking at, and it says so much more than just Italy, doesn't it?
Ah, yes, it says Mexico as well, which is why at the Mexican Olympics, that's when they put that great eagle and an old Aztec sign on the middle of the flag in case they won a medal. They didn't want anyone to think that Italy had won it. Yeah, this is the Italian flag, and I mean, I think I write in Worth Dying For, the book about, well, it's not really a book about flags, it's a book about nationalism and identity, but it's avocado, mozzarella, and tomato. That's what it shouts to me. And I think, I mean, I'm sure that's not what, but it's not what they meant. The origins of it go back to various militia in various parts. But leave that to one side. The fact is that now that flag, that soft power that it gives Italy, you stick it on the side of a car and there's design quality. Stick it on a flag in front of, you're walking down a street and you see that flag and oh great, there's an Italian restaurant there.
Hey, no, it says pasta to me. I mean,
okay. yeah. I mean, but how many flags? Not that many flags can do that. Can make you think of immediately flair, style, fashion, football, cooking. I mean, the French flag doesn't do that. The French flag may do something else. Other flags do other things. The Americans, you could make a fist of it saying,
it's a sort of postmodern idea. I mean, I guess the Union flag is the classic example with punk, the Sex Pistols, and then becoming sort of like a fashion thing on jeans and t-shirts.
Cool Britannia,
yeah. That kind of thing, but not even called Britannia, just the act of the sort of pop iconography.
It is the symbol of usually a bunch of tribes that have come together to form one mega tribe, and that is their symbol, and that's why these things are so important to people, because it is supposed to embody values that hopefully most people in the country agree with, and that is part of the glue that then holds them together. Of course, it's very problematic if you design a flag which excludes large amounts of people. I mean, an example of not doing that, I think, is the Kenyan flag, because in the middle of it there is a shield, but it's the symbol of one of the smallest tribes in Kenya, and therefore they can all embrace it. Whereas if it was the emblem of, let's say, the Kikuyus, who are, from memory, about 30% of the country, and their symbol was bang slapping in the middle of the flag, that would be problematic. And divisive.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I love this one here because I just thought it says so much more than just a nation, and you could almost talk with the Irish flag in different contexts. It says pub to me, but then if you put it in Northern Ireland, you know, it could mean something very different. So
well,
on
the negative note, you do know, of course, you know that the British flag is known by some people in Ireland as the butcher's apron. So of course, it is it's not just what the flag is saying to you, it's what you're saying to the flag, and it is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, let's go on to some other ones, and there's some lovely stories here. So let's just take us. We've got three interconnected flags coming up. So we're just going to describe what are we looking at here, Tim.
This is one of my favorites simply because of the story. I'll try and be brief, which is not easy on this one because we're going to go back 3,000 years. But this was the flag of Ethiopia when Haile Selassie was president, christened Ras Tafari, meaning head of the area, Rastafari, which is one of the reasons the Rastafarians use this flag. Now, you see the Lion of Judah is in the middle there. And that's because in folklore, maybe in fact, the very first Ethiopian emperor was the offspring of the Queen of Sheba and Solomon, the Lion of Judah. So it's been in their folklore for 3,000 odd years, but you see there's a cross there because it was a predominantly Christian country. The Rastafarians picked this up because there was a prophecy that the second coming of Jesus would come from the east. That's where Ethiopia is. And there's a whole, and they believe that Haile Selassie was actually God. There's a line in one of the Bob Marley songs in Get Up, Stand Up. You know, we know that God is a living man. They mean Haile Selassie. And the last thing to say about that, I could say a lot more. Red, gold, and green. It's still the color, but the communists took over and they couldn't have a Christian symbol, and they stuck something communist in it, and then they were overthrown, and there's something else in the middle now. But the red, gold, and green is a Pan-African colors because Ethiopia is the one country that was not fully colonized and in fact defeated the invaders. And so many African countries took inspiration from that, which is why you see those colors, you know, on maybe half the flags of the continent, and indeed the Jamaican flag. There's another story there about.
Let's bring the next. I think we've got. So that's the modern Ethiopian flag.
Yes, that's a flag with the star is because the future is bright for Ethiopia despite the current civil war.
So we've got a blue circle in the center, the same colors as the Rastafari flag, and then you've got the star, and you've got the 5 sort of spikes going out of it. But let's move on from that one and then go on to two.
Yeah, this is where Marcus Garvey comes in. Marcus Garvey was the black nationalist, originally from Jamaica, went to America, made his fortune there, believed in separation, and formed the Black Star Liner shipping company, which for a while was quite successful, but then wasn't. But he's buried actually in Jamaica, Marcus Garvey. He died not far from where I am at the moment in Hammersmith, and there's a blue plaque for him on the A4 if anybody wants to look for it.
Along, I think you've just got, it's just before you get to the flyover, those artists, beautiful.
When you're in traffic,
have
a look. Yeah, sorry. So that's partially why the Jamaican flag bears some of these colors, but the Black Star is because the first president of an independent Ghana, which I think was the first country to win its freedom, was a huge fan of Garvey and Garvey's writings. And because of the Black Star Liner, he put that Black Star in the middle of the flag. And to this day, the football team are known as the Black Stars.
It's fantastic. Here's the next one. Next flag. And so finally, we're in Jamaica, looking at the Jamaican flag.
You see the echo of the red, gold, and green of the Pan-African colors, which came from Ethiopia. And some of the black, I think, comes from the Marcus Garvey. And that's a pretty good example of soft power, because Jamaica's a very small country with a very small population, but you know, through music and sport and cuisine, you know, it has punched well above its weight in the world and still does.
Yeah, it's a great story. I mean, looking at this, you would never guess that goes all the way back to Solomon and Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Yeah. This, as you said, this is an example of a flag. So what we've talked about generally now is flags that unite people around ideas, give people a sense of national identity, and we'll talk about different identities in a second. But this is a flag that you argue doesn't work. What are we looking at here?
A gun. The Mozambique flag is problematic because it's got an AK-47 on it. That's not the biggest problem. It's got a hoe as well, so shout out to the farmers. The problem is that the symbol is very, very similar to one of the warring factions in the Civil War, and the one that basically won it. Now, there were about 5 different ethnicities in that Civil War, major ethnicities. And at the end of it, the one that was mostly triumphant sticks its symbol on the flag that's supposed to unify everybody. That's why it doesn't work. Even if I was from ethnicity X and my national flag says ethnicity Y, and with that bitterness that has gone on, I won't be happy. I mean, I'm not comparing the trials and tribulations of the UK to that particular country, but in the event of the UK having to redesign its flag, I think the Welsh would have a pretty strong argument to stick a dragon on it somewhere.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, no, you've got to bring everybody in, and this one's clearly an exclusive. Okay, that's maps. That's we've got so much. Hang on a second, we got that. Sorry, map flags. This is the last one. And it's just this is another really good illustration of it's about ideas as much as nations, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the gay flag, and where's the pink? Well, apparently there was a shortage of pink dye and ink, and it was a very expensive for whatever reason. Basically, this goes back to the 70s, to San Francisco, to the burgeoning gay movement, the politicization of the gay movement, and Harvey Milk, who was assassinated I think it was in San Francisco, certainly in California. And as part of the tributes to him, they designed a flag, which originally did have pink in it, which some people regard, well, it's a gay color. Mm. But again, look at the success of that branding. I mean, it swept the Western world and 1 or 2 outposts outside of the Western world. I mean, you will not find this flag flying outside a cafe in Uganda, because the cafe would not last very long. And in many other parts of the world. But in the more, what I would say, enlightened on this particular issue parts of the world, an incredible success story in just, 50 years? It's a internationally known symbol that is used left, right, and center. And it's a massive success story.
Yeah, no, it's you've also spoken about other flags. You talked about the Islamic State flag, which is sort of very almost basic. It's got a sort of very simplistic sort of.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, very briefly, about the Islamic State flag is I mean, there's all sorts of politics behind it. Muhammad flew a black flag. The writing on it is really rudimentary because they want to go back to rudimentary Islam. Yeah. But the real thing is to connect it to what they then did underneath that flag. The atrocities that they then, the incredible things that they did. Mm. So the flag then takes on an extra meaning because the moment you see it, it strikes fear, which is why the Iraqi army ran away in Mosul when those black flags appeared before them.
Yeah, no, okay, it's another aspect. Okay, let's flags. We've done flags now. On to the next thing, that's going in the other way. Now we're talking. Let's just hold off this one for a second. Let's just move the slides for a second. Just come back to Tim, because I want to talk about this is barriers. And I think what your book on we're living in an age of walls. The statistic that I was really shocked by: 65 countries around the world have got barriers or walls of some kind or other, and many of those have been built quite recently, which is really quite surprising. So that there's that thought there. But what does that say? And let's start with Trump's Trump's wall. What do you think that was about? What's the primary focus or purpose of that barrier? I know it's essentially keeping somebody else out, but what else does it say?
It's the barrier in your mind, because without that, you're not going to ever get the other ones built. I mean, that one's never going to be built anyway, but I digress. It was that stat you mentioned that actually was the genesis for the whole book, because the moment I came across it, I thought, hang on a minute, that's a third of all the countries in the world. Thought we were globalized. I thought this was the time, but it's not, sadly. So what has happened in the 20th century is the mass movement of people has accelerated for various reasons. There's the automation of work and people being put out of jobs. There's the ability to move. There's the ability to see how other people live and think, I want some of that for my family. And that's all come together. And so people are moving. Now, that wall in America, fence, most of it, actually goes all the way back to the 1920s and bootlegging. That's when it first appeared on the Mexican border, and it's grown a little bit over each decade. But then what Trump did was to tap in to the anxieties of people who were losing their jobs due to automation and, to an extent, migration and unemployment and all sorts of problems. He tapped into people's anxieties and used something that everyone could understand, a wall, a barrier, because he knew that there was a barrier in people's heads. A very instinctive politician. He rode in power. He didn't build the wall. I mean, I said in the book, Divided, he won't build it. He can't build it. There's all sorts of reasons why he can't, not least the Rio Grande River Treaty. That's another story. But what I do argue, Nick, and I think it's still important now, is that people still concentrate on Trump's wall. And that is because it's the land of the free, etc., shining beacon on the hill. But I do think it sucked the oxygen out of seeing what was going on all over the world, like India completely fencing off the entirety of Bangladesh, all 3,000 kilometers, and nobody even noticing because they were focusing on something else.
That's absolutely incredible, isn't it? Just briefly, and I'm going to start bringing questions in just a second. Just tell us about the barrier with Bangladesh.
Yeah, I mean, it's 3,000 kilometers long. It's got barbed wire, searchlights, patrols. I think it's 1,000 people have been shot dead trying to cross it this century. But it's a very similar response and rationale that it is in America. In India, in this century, I think, forgive me, I've forgotten the stats, but a huge, hundreds of thousands of people have come across the border from Bangladesh. And it has upset the demographics in the border states like Assam. And there's been ethnic rioting about it. We don't want those funny foreigners from Bangladesh coming up here taking our jobs. It might be a different language, but it's the same rationale and the same people's heads. And the response to it is to build a big barrier. And it's not unpopular in India.
Absolutely amazing. And it goes along with Modi's sort of Hindu nationalism. And I'm fascinated by the idea. He's also borrowed a lot of these ideas from Israel, with the idea of a sort of a Hindu state, the same as a Jewish state, with that sort of ethnic aspect or that religious aspect of your identity becoming enshrined in the nation. A nation of how many different nationalities going down that route is quite astounding. Let's bring in some questions. I want to, and then I'm going to come back. I want to talk about Israel and the separation wall or barrier in a second. We've got a map of that, and we'll come to that in just a second. But let's take a few questions first of all. And I've got Sheila de Beleg, and this is something you do write about. I think this is related to Brexit. Go ahead, Sheila. If you could just open your microphone up, Sheila. Go ahead, go on.
Hello. My question was perhaps rather an obvious one. To what extent do you think that the geography of this country was responsible for the outcome of the Brexit referendum, and indeed for our general inability to get on with our European neighbours over the centuries?
I think it's not, hello, Sheila, I don't think it's quantifiable, but I do think it did play a role, because I think in our national consciousness, most of us are aware we are an island. And just like the Japanese are very aware of who they are and that they are not, because they don't have the borders. I mean, France, I think, has 7 borders. And so, of course, it's relationships and it's ties and the 360 degrees that they look around to other people that are next to them. We don't have that. So I do think it played a role. But also, I mean, you say in our inability to get on with people, and you're right, that is part of our history. But I mean, even more so on the continent, their inability to get on with each other. And I think that played a role, because again, in this sort of collective consciousness, it's a nebulous concept, I know, but I do think we are aware that we have dodged the extremes that have happened in Europe. They have had many more wars, fought each other a lot more, and we've managed mostly to keep out of it because of that little strip of water. And then the extremes of politics, which swept places like Hungary, fascism and Nazism, Spain, Italy, Germany, Austria, and then communism as well, which I regard as an equally extreme ideology. And we've dodged all that. And I think that had a role to it. And again, I am not making a case for or against Brexit, but I'm just trying to answer your question. But I think it plays a role that you can't really measure, but is there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm 100% with you on that. If I just stick my oar in, I think most people in the UK have never had this existential necessity to be part of the EU. Whereas if you've been occupied by a foreign force, if you've committed a Holocaust, or you've had a dictatorship or foreign, communism.
I agree with you completely, because I don't think we understand the shock of World War II. Now, it was a shock to us, and we suffered, and we had huge losses, Blitz, D-Day, you name it.
Yeah.
But compared to the losses and the destruction on the European continent, it was nowhere near that. And it was that shock that finally drove them.
And I also think the anchor of empire and identity, whether you like it or not, you might not think of Britain in imperial terms anymore, but you certainly got a strong sense of identity that really comes from another. You're not trying to borrow it from anywhere else. And whereas the EU gives you that glue, holds things together, and we think, well, why do we need that glue? We don't need it. We're fine by ourselves. That's my sense. Anyway. Yeah, we're not here to interview me though, so I shall shut up. Let's bring in a few more questions. We've got Lois Tart. We've got quite a few questions coming in, so we need to rattle through them. Let's Lois Tart first in Sydney, Australia, and then we've got Hookie Walker coming after that. So go ahead, Lois.
Hello, Tim. My PhD was actually in geography and planning, you'd be pleased to know. And I could tell you all about mine subsidence, how it controls development. But what my real question is that we're seeing a lot in Australia about China trying to control the narrative around maps, particularly maps with borders. And we're finding that, Chinese students at universities object to maps that they find offensive. And it's that whole controlling the narrative around the map and the border and saying, China's been there in perpetuity, and they don't like old maps that show China being very small. And it's really that whole narrative about this is about our borders, etc. So it's that narrative around maps that I think I'm finding very interesting at the moment.
It's similar to the one I mentioned with Turkey earlier, but everybody does it. I mean, try calling that bit of water between Arabia and Iran, the Persian Gulf, and some Arabs will bite your head off. But if you call it the Arabian Sea, the Iranians will bite your head off. I mean, it's the same everywhere. But in your part of the world, it's very acute between Japan, Korea, and China. What you call these different strips of water. The Koreans and the Japanese also argue with each other about this. The Koreans don't like Sea of Japan, for example. But very few people are actually intending changing it. But China is, through its narrative, through its 9-line dash, through its insistence on always pressing it through the international forums. It means to change it legally, and if not, and if it thinks it can get away with it, it means to change it through force.
Yeah. Lois, have you got a follow-up to that?
I'm just, look, again, we're finding a variety of different narratives here, and it's interesting that, that China is continuing. I always remember one very early narrative on China was in the 90s when it was just opening up, and we all look at this huge China. And they made the comment that, remember, China is an empire. And they sort of said that all these narratives that China was going to be this, China was, how like narratives go for one direction only. And they point out, never assume that China won't break up.
Mm.
And that was a really interesting comment. And it comes up every now and then, and you go, yeah, that's always an interesting one to always assume. That there's always this assumption that China's empire will remain an empire and remain in perpetuity.
Yeah.
Well, it hasn't in the past, and it may not in the future.
Hookie Walker, are you there, Hookie? Just checking. Yeah.
Yeah, hello. I asked this question out of idleness because I never thought it through myself, but perhaps Tim Marshall has. Question is, are rivers normally unifiers or dividers? I've lived in Ethiopia where the rivers are dividers, but perhaps that's just because they have very steep banks. In Europe, perhaps the unifiers. Is there a rule or?
And Hookie, you've also lived in Iraq, where
well,
the Turkish relationship.
Well, then, of course, Iran and Iraq, they cut off. Yeah, we get rivers as dividers because the people at the headwaters can do damage to the people downstream.
That's why the answer isn't, one or the other, because it depends on the river. For example, you mentioned Ethiopia. That's a unifier inside Ethiopia because the Blue Nile is now, because of the dam they're building, allegedly going to give free electricity to every home in Ethiopia. So that's a unifier. Because downstream, down in Egypt, where no Nile, no Egypt, somebody else's hand is now on the tap of their water. It's very divisive. As you know from having lived in Iraq, both the Iraqis and the Syrians look up and think, well, the Turks have got their hand on the river. So, and they also divide, of course, because they are often natural barriers. The Rhine is an example. But where they're unifiers is when you can get to this periods, which is most of the time of peace. We are not at war most of the time. Where if you've got the right type of river, which we have in Europe, long and flat, you can grow your crops or good, whatever. You can ship them down there. Two areas grow up with connections and trade, and it's very positive. So I'm afraid they are both, sometimes simultaneously.
Yeah.
I'm going to, there's Diane Cook, who normally we're able to sort of bring online, but technically I think we've got a problem getting her on. So let me ask Diane Cook's question. Oh, Diane, you are there. Excellent. Yeah. Go ahead, Diane. Go on, far away.
And I'm unmuted, yes?
Yeah, you're fine.
Oh, good, yeah. I really just one comment and one question, because when you were talking about flags and walls, it seems to me it sounds terribly medieval, really, the battle flags and standards and the city walls. And my question was, leading on from that, was really that how do you see what you've been talking about working when we maybe will have significant changes to geography wrought by the effects of climate change?
Medieval, yes. It is simultaneously medieval, all this stuff, and it's simultaneously very 21st century. Again, there's a certain intellectual class, especially in the UK, which sort of pretends that most people are like them, whereas most people aren't. And nationalism and identity and belonging are very, very strong still. Again, I'm not making a case for or against that. I'm simply stating that I believe it to be the case. And when I look around the world, I can give you 193 pieces of evidence of the 193 countries that there are. Of course, geography is going to change. Oh my goodness. Climate change is going to change. I think it's going to change politics more than it's going to change geography.
Yeah, I was thinking about flooding and, coastal states changing shape and that sort of thing.
Yes, yeah. Bangladesh is a good example. If the modeling is right, the bottom third of it, you cannot inhabit it in 40, 50, 60 years because it'll be salinated because the sea comes up through the rivers, salinates all the land, you can't grow anything. What are you going to do? You're going to move. And where are you going to move? You're going to move to India. And we've already discussed the effects on that. And you're going to move elsewhere. And the effects of that on our politics. We have turned sharply to the extremes throughout Europe. Britain is actually, again, dodged that one. If you look at the politics in Germany, France, can you imagine in Britain, a far-right person like the National Front leader getting 34% of the vote. We are way off that sort of politics, but it's rampant throughout Europe. And it's driven partially, well, it's driven very much by identity, and it's driven partially by the movement of peoples. And that is going to continue because of and other factors, climate. In Central America, at the high ground, coffee growers are really struggling because of climate change. Poverty drives conflict, conflict drives people. People head up through Mexico, try to get into America, affecting their politics. And on we go around the world. Nigeria, Lagos is threatened over the next few decades with rising seawaters. Yeah, I mean,
Jim, I want to follow up on this one because I think it's really interesting. But by and large, you say that the barriers are sort of ineffective and they're more a reflection of people's desire to preserve a kind of identity because they don't want these foreigners coming in and just changing their way of life. And you're particularly strong on that when you look at the sort of migration from Africa. So long as you've got this wealth, whether it's in the United States and Central America or in Europe, and then you've got in the Sahel region such significant poverty, people are going to continue to want to go. And so you can construct all the barriers you like, but that's not going to move people's desire to take terrible risks in order to get there. But and this is what I'd like to bring up, the slide of Israel and Palestine. I think Israel and Palestine also follows that same form, but you argue differently, and I'd like to hear why. So if we can bring up that slide as well. Okay. And this is the separation barrier.
Well, firstly, I do need to say that this is not about being European or white. This is a global phenomenon. As India, Bangladesh, Turkey has built a wall completely walling off Syria. In South Africa, there have been huge riots in which Nigerians have been targeted and attacked in the streets for being foreigners. Zimbabweans get hunted down and attacked in the streets. This is not about some sort of white colonialism. It's a global, it's a human thing. Like I said, it's I don't think it's peaked, sadly. Israel's a really interesting one because people are so desperate to get to Israel. I mean, all people from all over the Middle East and Africa so want to get to Israel and go to Israel because it's such a success story. And that's why they built a triple fence on the Egyptian border to stop people. I mean, people from Thailand are flocking to Israel, desperate to get there. Now, if you talk about the separation barrier itself, I mean, that's obviously far more delicate and sensitive. I don't think I do argue that it's necessarily any different. I think it still flows from the same issues that we've dealt with, but with the added one of the large loss of life. I mean, I was a correspondent when crossed from Gaza into Israel, along with tens and tens of thousands of workers every day who used to go, hundreds of thousands, in fact, from Gaza into Israel. The problem came when the suicide bombing has arrived. At that point, the state, and again, I'm not making a case for or against Israel. I'm just saying that, I do look at most things dispassionately because I think it helps. At that point, the state of Israel has a choice to make. We are losing dozens and dozens of people, usually young people, because they often target students in cafes and things. We're losing dozens, hundreds, in fact, of people being murdered in suicide bombings. So we have a choice. We can keep these pathways open to the vast majority of 99.9% of Palestinians who dream of doing such a thing and who want to come to work. But we will pay the price of dozens and dozens and dozens of more people being murdered, our citizens. Or we can take the view that the primary responsibility of the government is to protect its own people, and we will stop these people from coming, and with them the suicide. That's the decision that they took. So from that perspective, on that side of the wall, this is a good wall, a good barrier. It's positive, it saves lives. But of course, on the other side of that barrier, hundreds of thousands of people lose their livelihood, plunged even deeper into poverty, treated incredibly badly, cut off from their family. It's a terrible wall, but it really does depend on which side of it you're on.
I mean, I'm going to where I differ with you on that one is I think if you look at the suicide bombings, they had dramatically fallen before even 20% of the barrier was constructed, when Hamas decided in 2005, 2006 to stop them. And I think the last one took place when about less than 50% of the barrier was up there. So I think Hamas had taken a decision already to pull away from that. And then
So
I think since then,
you're going to say, on my watch, we're going to stop this. Everyone can come back, knowing that the next time it happens, when you lose 73 people, you're out of office next time. You do that.
But since then, you continue to have knife attacks, and there are 400,000 Palestinians living in East Jerusalem. There are 2.5 million Israeli Arabs, and if you look at the last unrest, and so that, and for me, then the separation barrier fits into this sense of trying to establish a separate sense of identity, but also trying to, at that point, say, look, the settlements, this is where the new Israeli state's going to be. We seem to have.
Oh yeah, it is.
Yeah,
I mean, it's facts. It's facts on the ground. I mean, let's not get too bogged down in this. I mean, it is a relatively small conflict, but people are obsessed about it. I mean, people who boycott it. I often wonder, have they any idea when they're talking about the settlements that the Chinese have settled about 100 million people in Tibet? And they usually haven't, but there's this weird obsession about this particular conflict. But anyway, it's horrible what's happening there, and I don't see the solution. And what the Israelis have done is they have locked the door and thrown away the key. I mean, that condemns more generations of Palestinians to a terrible life in poverty. But the Israelis have locked the door and they've thrown away the key, and most of them don't even think about it anymore because they're not dying in the numbers they used to die in. It's not, they are managing their problem. They're no longer even trying to solve it.
No, sure. And I think when we've had a recent session on this with Anshul Pfeffer, who writes for Haaretz and also for The Economist, and he talks about how Benjamin Netanyahu sort of redefined that conflict very successfully. Tim, what are you working on next? And I want to talk to you a bit about the writing process and how you come up with ideas, because we were speaking briefly before this, and I was saying how much whilst I love writing, I found the process actually incredibly painful, and you were echoing some of that.
Yes. Hemingway, I think, said the secret to writing is ass to seat, fingers to keyboard. And he's right, because it's better to get anything down, because you can always then rewrite it or rip it up and throw it away. But if you haven't got anything down, you're in trouble. I'm not telling you what I'm working on for two reasons. One, I'm not working on anything. And two, I do have an idea percolating. But I'm a great believer in doing something and then talking about it, not talking about it.
Yeah.
Doing it. If, and it's only an if, one morning I wake up energized. Actually, at the moment, I'm in the middle of promoting the new book and festivals and stuff. So I'm enjoying myself. I'm quite busy. But if one morning I wake up and think, yep, got it, that idea, and I am going through, well, if I had this idea, how many chapters would it be? What would each chapter be about? Does it sustain itself? Is actually this a long magazine article? You just go through that process. And if one morning I wake up and think, actually, yeah, then I'll get on with it. The process.
The great thing about it is you're exploring these ideas. You're not being absolutist, as I said at the beginning. You're not trying to say, here's some golden rules about geography, bang, 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 and everything conforms to this. It's really an exploration of how these geographic features and ideas do dictate events, or how they influence events or shape events.
Yeah, influence and help to shape along with the other factors. Leaders do matter. I don't think they matter quite as much as people often think. Great stress, there can be a decision made by a leader that has massive ramifications, but most of the time, they are boxed in by so many other things. I don't think, for example, that any Russian leader would have taken decision different to Putin's in invading Crimea. So, yeah, I start from this premise that it's a complicated and yet simple world simultaneously. But whatever I do start with the geography. Leaders matter, people matter, ideas matter, cultural memory matters, and geography matters. But I've always found that geography is the one that sort of seems to get pushed out. And if you don't, Syria, if you don't explain, this is the geography of Syria. I'll give you one thing, Nick, which is why I was able to predict, and I obviously I get things wrong because anyone who predicts things is guessing. But I predicted very early on in the Syrian war, I was over there, Assad will not lose. And it wasn't based just on this one fact, but this one fact is interesting. At that time, it was reported he'd lost 50% of the country. He'd actually lost about 50% of the sand. Because when you look at Syria, there's only one motorway, and it connects every single major urban area. And he had the entirety of the motorway, except for about a 10-mile stretch, which cut off 2 places. And he controlled about 90% of the population, and he controlled access to the sea. And, when you know that sort of stuff, I don't care that he's lost the sand. He can wait to get that back.
Yeah.
So that's what it gives you, that added value of being able to see a situation. It's an extra part of the jigsaw.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to hold up this book here. If you haven't bought any of Tim's books, just buy this one first, because I love it. I absolutely love it. So this is the Prisoners of Geography are well explained in 12 simple maps. And just by way of example, here's Russia. Can you explain the choo-choo train, please, Tim?
Yes, because this is meant for children 8 to 13, depending on how precocious they are.
Yeah.
But you're going to have to read it, because but the basis of it is, if you can say to a 10-year-old, Russia is X gazillion square miles big, they haven't got a clue what you're on about.
Yeah.
Or even if you say it's 3,000 miles across, they're struggling. But if
it says here, it says Russia is so huge that it's hard to move people, food, and supplies around the country. It takes about 6 nights and 7 days to travel 9,258 kilometers from Vladivostok to Moscow on the Trans-Siberian Railway. So that
at which point a 10-year-old thinks, wow, 6 days and 7. Then they understand how big it is.
Yeah, no, I love it. I mean, I think if you've got a present to give to anyone for Christmas, this one could be that. It's a bit difficult to fit in the stocking, but it's a good one. Tim Marshall, thank you so much. It's been really good fun talking to you, and great. I've really been looking forward to the discussion. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks for everyone who tuned in.